Hello, Laverne here, and thank you for joining me. May this video be a blessing to you, and may it honor and glorify God in His kingdom. This video is in response to the one made by the atheist GoGreen. Now, in her video, she looks at an experiment that was performed back around 1962 by a man named Stanley Milgram. The experiment has been repeated over the years, but is now actually considered to be unethical, and you'll probably understand why as I explain it. The way the experiment worked is the experimenter, who is Stanley Milgram, placed an ad in the newspaper looking for volunteers, and the volunteers were paid $4 plus 50 cents for travel time. Now, back in that day, that $4.50, which was supposed to be for approximately 1 hour of their time, was kind of significant. Today, there are different ways of trying to determine inflation and what that amount would work out to today. I've tried to look at this myself, and what I've learned is that depending on who you talk to, the inflation rate is somewhere around 13 to 22 times what the amount would have been back at that time. So just working with somewhere around 20 times, just for a nice even number, that $4.50 would work out to approximately $80 today. So, and just comparing the two, that's as if you were to volunteer for an experiment that would last an hour and get paid $80. So please keep this in mind. Now, the person actually being tested, there was only one, and that is the person called the teacher. But he didn't know this. The experimenter would interview two people and explain that they were both part of this experiment. And then he would draw straws with someone who was an actor. The actor would draw a straw, and Milgram would announce that that person is going to be the student, while the other one, who did not draw a straw, is going to be the teacher. And then what happened is the student was taken to a room, and it was explained to the teacher that he would be hooked up to some electrodes, and the student was going to be asked a series of questions, and if he got the questions wrong, the teacher, in his role, was supposed to give the student a shock, and there was an increasing amount of shocks that were going to be given. The voltage would increase each time the student got the question wrong. So the teacher is the only one actually being tested here. This is who the experiment was on, and it was to determine how far someone would be willing to go in giving a person these electric shocks. Now keep in mind that the student really was not hooked up to any electrodes. He was not receiving any shock whatsoever, but there was a pre-recording that every time the teacher pressed a button, there would be a pre-recorded sound of the person complaining, saying ouch and so on, that hurt and that kind of thing. And so the experiment was to see how far a person was willing to go to give shocks to another person simply because the experimenter, someone in authority, was telling them to continue. Now, what Lacey GoGreen didn't explain is some of the phrases that were being used to try and push the person forward to keep giving the shocks. And I'm going to include actually a number of links that explain in good detail some of the things that the experimenter was actually saying, trying his best to get people to go on. And then if they refused after 4 times, then the experiment was called off. Now, as I said, I'm going to include some links. One is to a person who actually took part in the experiment. At the time of taking part in the experiment, he was 41 years old. He had been in World War II, so he had been in war, he had been under authority, but also had authority himself, and he writes a letter in a newspaper that explains the experience of the experiment with Milgram. And he explains that he was one of the people who would not go on, that he stopped at a particular point. And actually this is important to mention as well. GoGreen tells us that 90% of the people were willing to go to the maximum amount of the voltage. And this is not true. In Milgram's experiment, it was only 65% went all the way rather than 90%. There have been experiments that have been done since then, and in some cases the experimenter reported as high as 90% of people going on, but this is not the norm, and it is not what Milgram reported in his experiment. So GoGreen is wrong from giving this information. Now, getting back to the guy who wrote the letter, he wrote that he believed his reason for being able to reject the commands of the experimenter is because he had spent time in the army, as well as the way he was brought up. And in the army in particular, they taught him that he was supposed to obey commands unless it was something that was illegal. He also explained that he used to be part of the Communist Party, and he had been arrested in the 50s for being part of the Communist Party and almost ended up in jail. So he was the kind of person from the very beginning who would rebel, who would not give in to authority. Now GoGreen tries to present a different picture entirely of what the experiment showed. According to GoGreen, the people who did not go on, who refused to obey the commands of the experimenter, were people who were his peers, people who were like the experimenter and considered themselves to be his peers. But this is not the case. I spent a good 3 to 4 hours searching the internet. I read somewhere around 25 different articles, and I found nothing to support this. The only people who reported this kind of thing were people who were commenting on the experiment. But there was nothing from anybody that did any of these experiments that reported that it was the peers of the experimenter who were the ones that refused to go on. There is information, however, that describes that when they varied the experiment, when they took 3 people who were giving the shocks and they placed them beside one another, and so in this case they actually had 4 people who were supposed to be part of the experiment, but only one really was, and 3 actors were involved. The one who was pretending to be the student and taking the shocks, and then 3 others who were supposed to be teachers, but only one was actually the teacher. The other 2 stopped at a certain point and refused to go on, and the experiment was done in this way to determine if the actual student, the one, or rather the teacher that was being tested, if he would stop or if he would continue. And what they found is that if he was beside peers who refused to go on, then that person was more likely to reject the commands of the experimenter. That is what they found out about peers. It had nothing to do with the way GoGreen presents in her video. So she completely distorts the information from the experiment. Now I'm going to, as I explained, include certain links. And one of the things I found is that there was one particular person who also did not go on, who refused. He stopped at 175 volts. And his reason? Well, it turned out he was a minister. And it was because of his belief in a higher power that he refused to obey the commands of the experimenter. Even though the experimenter was saying things like, you must go on, you have to go on, you know, it's all part, it's important that you go on because of the knowledge that we're going to get from this. Think of the scientific good that, you know, the good that you're doing for the scientific realm and so on. And yet the minister refused. He stopped short of what the average person stopped. And the reason? Because of his higher power. Now GoGreen tries to tell us that it's important that people have knowledge and be educated, and then they'll be able to reject people And she gives the example of ministers and pastors from the pulpit who are telling people to live a certain way and giving them certain commands. According to her, the reason people are following pastors and ministers and so on is because they aren't educated. And that if they were educated, they wouldn't follow the commands and the such of the pastors and ministers. But what we find out, if you really look at all of the information that has come from these experiments, it is those people who believe in a higher power who are more likely to reject the experimenter and would not go on, would not continue to inflict pain. So GoGreen, your conclusions are completely out in left field. If you want to talk about morality and who's going to go on and follow the commands of people, the truth is that those people who are most likely to reject immoral commands are those people who believe in a higher power, who believe in a God, that they are answerable to a higher power. These are the people most likely. Now, actually, I would like to talk a bit more about this because this was actually a minister, someone who practiced and lived what he preached. At least we can assume this by the fact that he refused to go on and that he was a minister. Now, Scripture actually warns about warm Christians. We see this in the book of Revelation. There is a warning that God hates warm Christians. And there are many of them. And so it's not, as GoGreen says, that people need to be more educated. People need to be more in touch with God. If we're going to bring up an age of people who will reject people like the experimenter, trying to get them to inflict pain on others and going along with it because they believe what the experimenter is telling them. If we want to live in an age that this kind of thing will not happen, then it is not going to rely on education of people, but rather the higher power. The belief in a higher power, that we are answerable to someone other than the experimenter, other than the people in our government, and so on. It is a belief in a higher power and the love of that higher power that will prevent us from following, simply following the commands of people who are giving us immoral and unethical commands. All right, as always, I look forward to comments and messages. Till next time, peace and blessings.